The sun scorched the earth of Dry Canyon, New Mexico, in the summer of 1878, turning the air into a shimmering haze that warped the horizon like a fever dream. The town was a fragile outpost on the edge of the desert, its wooden buildings bleached gray by relentless heat, their roofs sagging like the shoulders of men who'd given up hope. Main Street was a ribbon of dust, flanked by the Rusty Spur Saloon, its sign creaking in the wind, a general store with a porch that groaned under every step, and a sheriff's office that seemed one storm away from collapse. The townsfolk moved with the slow, deliberate pace of those who knew the land offered no mercy. Ranchers in sweat-stained hats, shopkeepers with wary eyes, and drifters whose stories were etched in the lines of their faces. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush, horse sweat, and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder, a constant reminder that peace in Dry Canyon was a guest who never stayed long. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, a lone rider appeared at the town's edge. His black stallion, Shadow, snorted, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust that swirled like ghosts in the fading light. The rider's long duster-coat fluttered like a raven's wings, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, revealing only the sharp glint of eyes that had seen too much. A murmur rippled through the handful of townsfolk lingering on the boardwalk, their hands tightening on reins or broom handles. They didn't need to see his face to know him. This was Caleb Black Raven Reed, a bandit whose name was a curse whispered in saloons from Texas to Montana. He'd robbed banks in Denver, hijacked stagecoaches in Arizona, and left a trail of bodies in Abilene. Some said in self-defense, others swore in cold blood. To some, he was a devil on horseback. To others, a man running from a past heavier than the iron on his hip. Inside the Rusty Spur, Old Man Jenkins, a prospector with a face like cracked leather, hunched over his whiskey. His voice a gravelly rasp. "That's Black Raven," he muttered to the barkeep, Tom, a wiry man polishing a glass with a rag dirtier than the floor. "Hit the First National in Denver last spring. Shot 3 men in Abilene clean through the heart. Ain't no lawman ever caught him." Tom's eyes darted to the saloon's swinging doors, his hand tightening on the glass until his knuckles whitened. "What's a man like that doing in Dry Canyon?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the name might summon the outlaw. Jenkins spat tobacco into a spittoon, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Trouble," he said, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Always trouble." By noon, word of Caleb's arrival had spread like wildfire through the town's dusty streets, carried on the lips of barmaids and stableboys. Sheriff Amos McGraw, a man whose badge seemed to weigh more than his 60 years, stood in his office, his hands trembling not from age but from the storm he sensed brewing. His hair was white as bone, his eyes sunken from too many nights staring down death, but his resolve was forged in iron. He pinned a wanted poster to the bulletin board outside, the paper stark against the weathered wood. Caleb Black Raven Reed. Wanted for robbery, murder, and stagecoach hijacking. $5,000 reward, dead or alive. The ink seemed to bleed into the grain, as if the town itself was marking its fate. The poster was a spark in a dry field, igniting a frenzy that drew bounty hunters to Dry Canyon like vultures to a fresh kill. The Jenkins brothers, twin giants with sawed-off shotguns and tempers as volatile as dynamite, rode in from the north, their laughter booming like thunder across the plains. Old Buck, a wiry tracker with a face carved by scars and a mouth full of boasts, claimed he'd caught 30 outlaws in his day, though his stories grew taller with every whiskey he downed. Then there was Isabella Crowe, the only woman among them, a 25-year-old enigma with a braid of dark hair that swung like a pendulum and a revolver engraved with a hawk. Her reputation was a shadow that stretched far beyond Dry Canyon. She'd brought in Mad Dog Malone single-handedly, her bullet finding his heart before he could draw. Some said her aim was blessed by angels. Others whispered it was a deal with the devil. Isabella didn't care for the rumors. She sat in the corner of the Rusty Spur, her hat tilted low, sipping black coffee and listening to the whispers about Black Raven. $5,000 was a fortune, enough to buy a ranch, a new life, or a ticket out of this godforsaken desert. But something about Caleb's arrival gnawed at her, a quiet warning in her gut that this wasn't just another bounty. Bandits like him didn't ride into towns without a plan. Isabella was no stranger to danger. She'd grown up in a border town, raised by her father, Elijah Crowe, a lawman who taught her to shoot before she could read. He'd shown her how to track a deer through the brush, how to read a man's intentions in the flick of his eyes, how to survive in a world that devoured the weak. When she was 16, a gang of outlaws ambushed his posse in the hills outside El Paso, leaving him bleeding out in the dust, his badge clutched in his hand. Isabella had found him, her screams swallowed by the night, her hands stained with his blood as she swore she'd never be helpless again. Bounty hunting became her armor, her way of bending the world to her will. Each outlaw she brought in was a step toward burying the pain, though it clung to her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She began her hunt at dawn, riding her gray stallion Storm to the outskirts of town. The other bounty hunters were already tearing through the plains, the Jenkins brothers bullying saloon patrons with threats of broken bones, old bucks sniffing out tracks in the rocky hills, but Isabella worked alone. She trusted her instincts, honed by years of chasing ghosts across deserts and mountains. She followed faint hoofprints leading to a dry creek bed, their edges softened by the wind, then to a cluster of abandoned shacks half swallowed by gnarled juniper trees. The air was still, the only sound the buzz of cicadas and the crunch of her boots on gravel. Her hand rested on her revolver, its hawk engraving cool against her palm, the weight of it grounding her. 6 bullets, each one a promise, each one a piece of her father's legacy. Caleb, meanwhile, was holed up in a miner's cabin, hidden among the junipers, its walls sagging under the weight of time. He wasn't running, not yet. He'd come to Dry Canyon for a reason, one he kept locked behind his steely gaze. A leather-bound journal lay open on a rickety table, its pages yellowed and filled with names, dates, and cryptic notes scratched in black ink. One name was circled in red: Elijah Crowe. Caleb's jaw tightened as he traced the name with a calloused finger, his eyes distant, haunted by memories he couldn't bury. This wasn't about gold or glory. This was personal, a debt carved into his soul. He checked his carbine, its barrel gleaming in the dim light filtering through cracked shutters, and listened for the sound of approaching hooves. He knew the hunters were coming. He'd always known. Back in town, the Jenkins brothers were stirring chaos, kicking over barrels outside the general store and bellowing, "Where's Black Raven?" Their voices carried like a storm, scattering townsfolk like leaves in a gale. Old Buck, more methodical, was tracking Caleb's trail but had lost it in the rocky hills, his muttered curses swallowed by the wind. Sheriff McGraw watched from his office, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on his desk, his eyes scanning the street. He'd seen towns torn apart by men like Caleb before, and he'd seen bounty hunters turn streets into battlegrounds. Dry Canyon was a powder keg, and the fuse was burning faster than he could track. Isabella reached the cabin by midday, her shadow stretching long across the parched earth. She spotted Shadow tethered to a post, his black coat gleaming like oil in the sun, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. Her heart quickened, but she moved like a specter, her boots silent on the dust, her breath steady despite the heat pressing against her chest. She crept to the window, peering through the dusty glass. Caleb sat at the table, his back to her, his hat resting beside the journal. He was writing, his hand steady despite the danger closing in. Isabella's finger hovered over the trigger of her revolver. One shot and she'd be rich. One shot, and her name would echo across the west, a legend carved in lead and blood. But then he turned, as if sensing her presence, his eyes locking with hers through the glass. They weren't the eyes of a killer, cold and empty. They were deep, haunted, carrying a weight she couldn't name, a sorrow that mirrored her own. "You gonna shoot me, Miss Crowe?" he called, his voice low and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. She stepped inside, the door creaking on rusted hinges, her revolver raised, her braid swinging like a pendulum. "Give me a reason not to," she said, her voice sharp, though a tremor betrayed her, a crack in the armor she'd worn for years. Caleb smiled, a flicker of something dangerous and alive in his eyes, like a spark in a dry field. "Maybe I will." She didn't shoot. She couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way he didn't reach for his carbine, resting against the wall, or the way he spoke her name like he knew her, like he'd seen the scars she hid beneath her duster. Instead, she demanded answers, her grip tightening on the revolver. "Why are you here, Reed? What's in Dry Canyon?" He leaned back in the chair, its wood groaning under his weight. His hands open to show he meant no harm. "You ever lose something you can't replace, Isabella?" he asked. His voice soft but heavy, like a stone dropped in still water. "Something that keeps you awake at night, gnawing at your soul?" Her blood ran cold. His words struck too close, stirring memories of her father's lifeless body. His badge glinting in the moonlight, the night she lost everything. "Don't talk like you know me," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. "Maybe I do," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. He slid the journal across the table, its leather cover worn and stained. "Read it." Against her better judgment, she lowered her gun just enough to flip open the journal, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. The entries were a map of Caleb's past, robberies planned in smoky backrooms, hideouts marked in deserts and mountains, names of men long dead or still running. But one entry stopped her cold. A stagecoach robbery 10 years ago, a job gone wrong in the hills outside El Paso. Elijah Crowe had been a passenger, a lawman in disguise carrying a strong box of gold meant for a federal bank. The gang didn't know who he was until the shooting started. Elijah killed 2 of them, his revolver blazing like a storm, before a bullet found his heart. Caleb wasn't there that day. He'd been scouting ahead miles away, but the guilt had clung to him like a shadow, growing heavier with every year. The journal named the man who gave the order, Silas Kane, now the respected banker of Dry Canyon. His mansion on the hill, a mockery of the blood on his hands. Isabella's hands shook as she read her father's name, marked with a date and a single word: dead. Her vision blurred, rage and grief twisting in her chest like a knife. "How do you know this?" she demanded, her voice trembling, her eyes burning as she looked at Caleb, searching for a lie, a trick, anything to dismiss the truth staring back at her. "I've spent 10 years tracking the men who were there," Caleb said, his voice raw, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Kane's the last. He's built a throne on lies, payoffs, stolen gold, a whole network of outlaws answering to him. I came to Dry Canyon to end it. You want justice for Elijah Crowe. So do I." Her finger twitched on the trigger, torn between the urge to shoot and the nagging pull of his words. She'd hunted men like Caleb her whole career, outlaws who spun tales to save their skin. But this wasn't a tale. The journal's details were too precise. Dates, locations, the names of men she'd heard whispered in her father's stories. Silas Kane, with his polished suits and slick smile, a killer. The thought churned in her gut, a mix of rage and disbelief. She snapped the journal shut, her eyes never leaving Caleb's. "If you're lying," she said, her voice low and deadly, "I'll bury you myself." He nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes never wavering. "Fair enough. But you know I'm not." The silence stretched taut, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote, its cry echoing through the junipers. Isabella holstered her revolver, the weight of her decision settling like dust on her shoulders. "What's your plan?" she asked, her voice cold but curious, her mind already racing with the possibility of exposing Kane. Caleb leaned forward, his hands still open, non-threatening. "Kane's untouchable in public. Too many friends, too much money. But he's hosting a poker game at his mansion during the Harvest Festival tomorrow night. The town will be distracted, streets full of folks. I go in as a gambler, get close to him. You get me in, I get proof, ledgers, letters, anything tying him to that robbery." "And why would I help you?" she countered, though her mind was already piecing together the plan, the chance to finally face the man who'd taken her father. "Because you want the truth as bad as I do," he said, his voice softening, his eyes searching hers with a sincerity that caught her off guard. "And because you're not the kind to let a man like Kane walk free." Isabella's jaw tightened. Helping Caleb meant risking everything. Her reputation as a bounty hunter, her safety, maybe her life. But the thought of Kane, sipping whiskey in his mansion while her father's blood stained his hands, was a fire she couldn't douse. She nodded, her decision made, though doubt lingered like a shadow. "We do this my way," she said. "One wrong move and you're done." Caleb's smile returned, faint but genuine, a spark of something dangerous and alive. "Wouldn't expect anything less, Miss Crowe." The next day, Dry Canyon buzzed with the anticipation of the Harvest Festival. The town transformed into a kaleidoscope of light and sound. Lanterns hung from every post, casting a warm, flickering glow over Main Street, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. The air carried the scent of roasted corn, fresh-baked bread, and the sweet tang of apple cider, mingling with the laughter of children chasing fireflies and the lively strum of fiddles from the town square. Townsfolk danced in the streets, their boots kicking up dust, their faces flushed with the rare joy of a night free from the desert's grind. But beneath the revelry, tension simmered like a storm waiting to break. The Jenkins brothers, their sawed-off shotguns slung over their shoulders, prowled the edges of the crowd, their eyes scanning for any sign of Black Raven, their drunken shouts cutting through the music. Old Buck, his weathered face set in a scowl, questioned ranchers at the edge of town, his bloodhound instincts pulling him closer to Caleb's trail. Sheriff McGraw, stationed on the porch of his office, watched the crowd with a gaze that missed nothing, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on his belt, his revolver close at hand. The $5,000 bounty on Caleb's head was a siren call, and every hunter in Dry Canyon was listening, their greed a palpable force in the air. Isabella prepared in a rented room above the general store, her movements precise as she traded her duster for a deep blue dress borrowed from Maria, the saloon singer with a voice like honey and a past she kept buried deeper than a desert grave. The dress felt foreign, its folds soft against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough leather she was used to. But it hid her revolver, strapped to her waist, and a knife sheathed against her thigh, their weight grounding her in the unfamiliar softness. She studied herself in a cracked mirror, her braid tucked under a bonnet, her face unfamiliar without the shadow of her hat. The disguise was a necessity. She'd be a guest at Kane's mansion, slipping through the elite crowd while Caleb played his part. But the weight of the journal's truth, her father's name marked in red, made her hands tremble as she adjusted the knife's sheath, her reflection a stranger staring back. Caleb, meanwhile, had transformed into a gambler's guise, his duster replaced by a silk vest and a tailored coat that made him look almost respectable. His black hair was slicked back, his hat traded for a gambler's flat cap, but his eyes, sharp, restless and haunted, betrayed the outlaw beneath. He'd spent the morning memorizing the layout of Kane's mansion, stolen from a drunken rancher's loose lips in the saloon. The poker game was the key. Kane's inner circle would be there, men with secrets as dark as his own, men who'd built their wealth on blood and betrayal. Caleb's plan was simple: get close, find evidence, and get out before the noose tightened. But with Isabella involved, the stakes were higher than ever. He didn't trust her not to turn on him, not to pull the trigger when the moment came. Yet something in her eyes, the same fire he carried, the same refusal to break, made him hope she wouldn't. They met at dusk, in the shadow of an old barn at the town's edge, the festival's music drifting on the wind like a distant memory. Isabella's dress caught the fading light, her eyes sharp beneath the bonnet, her hand resting near her hidden revolver. "You ready?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze searching his for any sign of deceit. "Born ready," Caleb replied, his tone light but his eyes serious, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "You?" She didn't answer, just nodded, her jaw tight, and they moved toward the mansion, blending into the festival crowd like shadows slipping through smoke. The Jenkins brothers were nearby, their drunken shouts cutting through the fiddles, their shotguns gleaming in the lantern light. But Isabella and Caleb slipped past, their steps silent, their purpose shared but fragile, a thread stretched taut between trust and betrayal. Kane's mansion loomed on the hill overlooking Dry Canyon, its windows glowing like eyes in the night, its whitewashed walls a stark contrast to the desert's roughness. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, the clink of glasses, and the low murmur of men betting fortunes at a green felt poker table. Ranchers, merchants, and a few out-of-town speculators sat around the table, their laughter masking the undercurrent of greed, their eyes glinting with the promise of wealth. Silas Kane presided over the game, his polished suit and slick smile a facade that hid the killer beneath. His hair was silvered, his eyes cold as steel, but his charm was a weapon, disarming those who didn't know better. Caleb took a seat at the table, his gambler's grin easy, his hand steady as he anteed up with a stack of coins he'd won in a backroom game the night before. He played his role well, laughing at the right moments, folding at the right hands, but his eyes were locked on Kane, watching for any crack in the banker's polished armor. Isabella slipped into the ballroom, her blue dress blending with the wives and daughters of Dry Canyon's elite, their silk gowns and pearl necklaces a world apart from her usual world of dust and blood. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room for Kane's hired guns, her hand brushing the revolver hidden beneath her skirt. The music from the festival outside filtered through the windows, a faint counterpoint to the tension coiling in her chest. She caught Caleb's eye across the room, a brief nod passing between them, a silent agreement that the game was on. Upstairs, Isabella found Kane's study, its heavy oak door locked but no match for the skills her father had taught her. She knelt, pulling a hairpin from her bonnet, and worked the lock with steady hands, her breath held as the tumblers clicked. The door swung open, revealing a room of opulence. Mahogany desk, velvet curtains, a painting of a desert sunset hiding a safe bolted to the wall. Her pulse quickened as she crossed the room, her boots silent on the plush rug. She studied the safe, its combination lock gleaming in the lamplight, and set to work, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. Minutes stretched like hours, the festival's music a distant hum, until the safe clicked open, revealing a treasure trove of secrets. Ledgers bound in black leather, gold bars stacked like firewood, and a single sheet of paper listing names from Caleb's old gang. Her father's name was there, Elijah Crowe, marked with a red X, alongside others she recognized from wanted posters tacked up in every sheriff's office from here to Texas. The ledgers detailed payoffs to outlaws, stolen gold funneled through Kane's bank, and a network of corruption that stretched beyond Dry Canyon to cities as far as San Francisco, with cryptic references to a figure called the Broker. Her hands shook as she stuffed the ledgers into a hidden pocket sewn into her dress, the weight of the truth heavier than the paper itself, her father's memory a fire in her chest. Downstairs, Caleb was holding his own, his bets bold but calculated, his eyes locked on Kane as the banker dealt another hand. The air was thick with tension, the other players oblivious to the storm brewing at the table. Kane's smile never wavered, but his glances were sharp, probing, like a predator sensing blood. "You look familiar, stranger," he said, his hand resting on a derringer at his belt, his voice smooth but laced with suspicion, a snake's hiss beneath the charm. Caleb's heart skipped, but he laughed, raising his glass of whiskey in a mock toast. "Got one of those faces," he said, his tone easy, though his mind raced for an escape, his hand inching toward the knife hidden in his sleeve. Before Kane could press further, the ballroom doors burst open with a crash that silenced the room. Two of Kane's hired guns stormed in, their revolvers gleaming in the lamplight, their faces hard as granite. The crowd gasped, cards scattering across the table, glasses tipping over in a cascade of whiskey and glass. "You should have stayed out of this, Crowe," Kane sneered, his eyes finding Isabella as she descended the stairs, the ledgers hidden but her presence a betrayal that lit his face with fury. "And you, Reed, I thought you'd be smarter than to come after me." The standoff was a heartbeat from bloodshed, the air so thick with tension it seemed to hum. Isabella's hand hovered near her hidden revolver, her mind calculating angles and exits, her eyes flicking between Kane and his men. Caleb's gaze met hers, a silent signal to wait. His own hand inches from the knife in his sleeve. His body coiled like a spring. Kane's men flanked him, their fingers twitching on their triggers, their revolvers trained on the pair. The guests froze, their faces pale, their wealth useless in the face of death, their whispers swallowed by the pounding of Isabella's heart. Caleb moved first, his hand a blur as he hurled a chair at one of the hired guns, the wood splintering as it struck the man's arm, sending his shot wild. Caleb dove behind the poker table, bullets tearing through the air, splintering the green felt. Isabella rolled behind a marble statue of a rearing horse, drawing her revolver and firing at the second gunman. Her shot grazed his shoulder, and he staggered, cursing, blood seeping through his shirt in a dark bloom. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests screamed, fleeing toward the exits, their silk dresses tangling, their boots slipping on spilled whiskey. Lanterns flickered, casting wild shadows as Caleb and Isabella fought back to back, their movements a deadly ballet honed by instinct and desperation. Isabella shot the first gunman in the leg, sending him sprawling with a howl, his revolver skittering across the floor. Caleb disarmed the other with a swift kick to the wrist, his carbine barking once to end the threat, the bullet finding the man's shoulder, non-lethal but enough to drop him. Kane, however, was gone, slipping out a side door into the night, his polished shoes silent on the grass, his shadow swallowed by the festival's glow. Isabella and Caleb pursued, their boots pounding through the mansion's halls, past overturned tables and scattered cards, their breaths ragged but determined. The festival outside was a blur of light and sound, townsfolk scattering like startled birds as the pair pushed through the crowd, their eyes locked on the hill's edge. Kane had a horse waiting, its eyes wild in the moonlight, its hooves pawing the ground impatiently. He turned, firing his derringer wildly, the shots cracking like thunder in the night. Isabella was faster, her revolver flashing as her bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve. He stumbled, dropping the gun, his face twisted in pain and fury, blood dripping onto the dust. "Don't kill him," Caleb said, stepping forward, his carbine lowered, his voice steady but urgent, his eyes pleading. "He needs to face justice, Isabella. For your father, for everyone he's hurt." Isabella's finger trembled on the trigger, her father's face flashing in her mind. His laugh as he taught her to shoot, his stories by the fire, his blood soaking the desert floor. Justice meant a noose, a public reckoning for the man who'd taken everything from her. But Caleb's plea stirred something in her, a flicker of doubt, a whisper of something deeper, something she didn't dare name. She lowered her gun, her breath ragged, her chest tight with the weight of the moment. They bound Kane's hands with rope from his own stable, his curses muffled as they tied him to the saddle, planning to deliver him to Sheriff McGraw and expose his crimes to the town. But the desert had other plans. As they rode back to Dry Canyon, the Jenkins brothers ambushed them, their shotguns roaring in the darkness like a storm unleashed. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the wagon they'd commandeered to carry Kane, the wood cracking like bones. Isabella ducked behind a boulder, returning fire, her shots precise but hurried, her heart pounding as she caught sight of Caleb pinned down behind the wagon's wreckage. Kane seized the chaos, wrenching free of his bonds with a strength born of desperation. He mounted a stray horse, his wounded arm dangling, and vanished into the desert, his silhouette swallowed by the night, leaving only dust and curses in his wake. Battered and bleeding, Isabella and Caleb took shelter in a cave, its mouth hidden by juniper and jagged rock, the starlight filtering through the entrance in slivers of silver. They patched their wounds in silence, the sting of whiskey on torn skin a sharp counterpoint to the night's quiet. Isabella's hands were steady as she bandaged a gash on Caleb's arm, but her mind churned. Kane's escape, the ledger's weight in her saddlebag, the truth of her father's death, a fire that refused to die. For the first time they spoke not as hunter and prey, but as equals, their voices low, their words raw, stripped bare by the night. Caleb told her of his sister Lila, who'd died of fever when he was barely a man. Her frail hand clutching his as she slipped away. "Thought gold could fill the hole she left," he said. His eyes fixed on the stars. His voice barely a whisper. "It never did. Just made it deeper." Isabella shared her own scars, the night she found her father, his badge gleaming in the moonlight, the vow she made to never be weak again. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted, her voice breaking, the cave's walls swallowing the sound. "Living for revenge. It's a fire that burns you up, leaves nothing but ash." "Then don't," Caleb said, his hand brushing hers, the touch electric in the cool night air, sending a shiver through her that she couldn't ignore. "Redstone's a week's ride north. A place for folks like us. Outlaws, dreamers, anyone looking for a clean slate. Come with me, Isabella." She wanted to believe him, to imagine a life beyond the hunt, beyond the weight of her father's badge. But the $5,000 bounty on Caleb's head loomed like a storm cloud, a reminder of the world they lived in. "You're a wanted man, Caleb," she said, pulling her hand away, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "There's no running from that, not for you, not for me." He looked away, the truth a wall between them, solid as stone. At dawn, he left her a note, scrawled on a scrap of paper torn from his journal. "Find me in Redstone if you choose. We'll wait." Then he was gone, his horse's hoofprints fading into the sand, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts, the ledgers, and a choice she wasn't ready to make. Isabella returned to Dry Canyon, the ledgers tucked under her arm. Her face set in determination despite the bruises on her body and the turmoil in her heart. She marched into Sheriff McGraw's office, slamming the ledgers on his desk, the thud echoing like a gunshot. McGraw's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages, his hands trembling as he read the names, the dates, the proof of Kane's crimes. Payoffs to outlaws, stolen gold, a network of corruption that implicated men in towns as far as Santa Fe. This is bigger than Dry Canyon," he muttered, his voice hoarse, his face pale as he realized the weight of what he held. The town hailed Isabella as a hero, the $5,000 reward hers for the taking, a fortune that could buy her freedom from the life she'd led. But victory tasted like ash, bitter and empty. Caleb's note burned in her pocket, a question she couldn't answer, a pull she couldn't shake. Days turned to weeks, and Dry Canyon tried to return to normal, but the scars of that night lingered. The Jenkins brothers, furious at losing their prey, left town in a storm of curses, vowing to hunt Black Raven to the ends of the earth. Old Buck, his trail gone cold, lingered in the saloon, his boasts quieter now, his eyes haunted by something he wouldn't name. Sheriff McGraw sent word to federal marshals, the ledgers sparking a manhunt for Silas Kane, but the desert was vast, and Kane was a ghost, slipping through every net. Isabella, meanwhile, wrestled with her choice. The reward money sat in a bank account, untouched, a reminder of the life she could have. A ranch, a home, a place to rest. But rest was a luxury she didn't know how to claim. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire, Isabella stood at a crossroads just outside town, Storm's reins in her hand, her father's badge heavy in her saddlebag. Redstone was a week's ride north, a town where outlaws and dreamers carved out new lives, where Caleb might be waiting. His note a promise or a trap. She could join him, risk everything for a chance at something more than vengeance, something that felt dangerously like love. Or she could stay, chasing bounties until the desert claimed her soul. Her father's shadow her only companion. The wind carried the scent of rain, a rare promise in the arid land, the air cool against her skin. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's voice, his lessons, his laugh. She thought of Caleb, his haunted eyes, his hand brushing hers in the cave. She mounted Storm, her decision made, though doubt lingered like a shadow, a whisper of what might be lost. As she rode north, the horizon stretched vast and uncharted, a canvas of possibilities painted in dust and starlight. Whether she'd find Caleb or only herself, she didn't know. But for the first time, she felt the weight of her father's badge lighten, if only a little, as the desert fell away behind her. The journey to Redstone was a gauntlet of trials, each one testing Isabella's resolve. The first day, a sandstorm swept across the plains, the wind howling like a banshee, stinging her face with grit and forcing her to take shelter in a shallow cave. She huddled with Storm, her arms around his neck, the ledgers pressed against her chest like a talisman. In the quiet moments, her mind drifted to her father, to the summer he'd taught her to shoot, his calloused hands guiding hers. "Aim with your heart, Bella," he'd said, his voice warm, steady. "The gun's just a tool." The memory was a knife, sharp and sweet, cutting through the years. She wondered if he'd approve of her riding toward an outlaw, toward a man who carried the same guilt she did. On the third day, a lone bandit ambushed her at a narrow pass, his revolver glinting in the noon sun. He was young, barely older than she'd been when her father died, his eyes wild with desperation. "Hand over the saddlebags," he demanded, his voice shaking, his gun unsteady. Isabella didn't draw, her hand resting on her revolver, but her eyes locked on his. "You don't want this fight," she said, her voice calm but firm, the voice of someone who'd seen too many bodies in the dust. He hesitated, then lowered his gun, backing away before turning tail. She let him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she'd been him once, driven by loss, by hunger for something she couldn't name. By the fifth day, the desert gave way to rolling hills, the air cooler, the horizon dotted with scrub pines. Isabella's doubts grew with every mile. Caleb's note a weight in her pocket. What if he'd lied? What if Redstone was a trap, a way to lure her into his world of crime? But the memory of his eyes, the way he'd spoken her father's name, kept her moving forward. She camped under a sky ablaze with stars, the ledgers open beside her, their pages revealing more than Kane's crimes. Names, dates, and cryptic notes hinted at a larger network, a figure called the broker who pulled strings from the shadows, a puppeteer whose reach extended to marshals, judges, and maybe even sheriffs. The thought chilled her, the realization that Kane was just a piece of a larger puzzle, one her father might have died trying to solve. Redstone was a speck of a town, nestled in a valley where the desert met the mountains, its streets alive with the chaos of new beginnings. Saloons and boarding houses stood shoulder to shoulder with blacksmiths and stables, the air thick with the scent of pine and hope. Isabella rode in at dusk, her dress traded back for her duster, her hat pulled low, her eyes scanning the crowd for a familiar silhouette. She found Caleb at a small ranch on the town's edge, his sleeves rolled up, his hands calloused from honest work. He was mending a fence, his movements steady, his face softened by the setting sun. He looked up as she approached, his eyes lighting with something that made her heart skip, a mix of relief, hope, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. "You came," he said, his voice low, a smile tugging at his lips as he wiped sweat from his brow. "Didn't have much choice," she replied, dismounting, her hand resting on Storm's reins, her eyes searching his for the truth. "You really trying to go straight, Caleb?" "Trying," he said, his smile fading, his eyes honest. "Ain't easy, but I owe it to Lila, to myself, maybe to you." They stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Isabella wanted to believe him, to let go of the hunt, but the ledgers in her saddlebag were a reminder of the world they couldn't escape. "Kane's still out there," she said. "And whoever this broker is, they're bigger than him. This ain't over." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we finish it together." Before she could answer, hoofbeats thundered in the distance, a cloud of dust rising on the horizon. Kane's men, a half-dozen riders armed to the teeth, had tracked them to Redstone, their eyes gleaming with the promise of blood and revenge. Caleb grabbed his carbine, Isabella drew her revolver, and they took cover behind the ranch's barn, their backs pressed against the wood, their breaths synchronized. The riders opened fire, bullets splintering the barn, the air alive with the crack of gunfire and the screams of startled townsfolk. Isabella and Caleb fought as one, their shots precise, their movements a dance of survival. She took down 2 riders with clean shots to their shoulders, non-lethal but enough to drop them. Caleb's carbine roared, felling another, his aim steady despite the chaos. But the numbers were against them, and a bullet grazed Isabella's arm, the pain sharp but fleeting. Caleb pulled her behind a haystack, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes fierce. "Stay with me," he said, his voice a lifeline in the storm. They made a stand, their ammunition dwindling, the riders closing in. But then a new sound. Hoofbeats from the town, a posse of Redstone locals led by a grizzled rancher who'd taken a liking to Caleb. The tide turned, the riders scattered, and Isabella and Caleb stood breathless, their hands still gripping their weapons, their eyes locked in a moment of shared survival. The dust settled, the riders gone, but the danger lingered like a storm on the horizon. Isabella and Caleb sat by a campfire that night, the ranch quiet, the stars above a blanket of light. The ledgers lay between them, their secrets a weight neither could ignore. A single page, torn from the journal, held a new clue, a name, a place, a meeting point for the broker. Isabella's heart raced at the thought of chasing a shadow bigger than Kane, a shadow that might have orchestrated her father's death. "I can't stop now," she said, her voice steady, her eyes on the fire. "Not until the broker's done." Caleb nodded, his hand brushing hers, the touch a promise. "Then we do it together. No more running." She looked at him, her heart torn between the hunt and the man beside her. Redstone offered a chance at a new life, but the truth was a call she couldn't ignore. She folded the note, tucking it into her pocket, and stood, her decision made but her future uncertain. The horizon stretched wide, a canvas of dust and starlight, and as they rode out together, the desert whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered, of battles yet to be fought, of a love that might survive the fire.